Hi, I'm Dr. Mary George Varghese. I'm an assistant professor and consulting clinical psychologist. I'm going to talk about classical conditioning theory given by Ivan Petrovich Pavlov. Pavlov's classical conditioning belongs to behaviorism. Behaviorism is a school of thought in psychology based on the assumption that learning occurs through interaction with the environment. That means the environment shapes human behavior. Taking internal mental states such as thoughts, feelings, and emotions is useless while explaining human behavior. Classical conditioning is a learning process that occurs through associations between an environmental stimulus and a naturally occurring stimulus. So, classical conditioning involves placing a neutral signal before a naturally occurring reflex. So, now let's try to understand this classical conditioning with the help of the experiment conducted by Pavlov. In Pavlov's experiment, the unconditioned stimulus, that is food, could give the unconditioned response, that is drooling of saliva. The neutral stimulus, that is bell, which could give no response before conditioning. So during conditioning, the neutral stimulus, that is bell, paired with the unconditioned stimulus, that is food, could give the unconditioned response, that is drooling of saliva. So after conditioning, what Pavlov could observe is conditioned stimulus, that is bell, could give the conditioned response, that is drooling of saliva. So based on this experiment, Pavlov has come up with certain principles involved in the process of conditioning. The first one is the unconditioned stimulus. The unconditioned stimulus is one that unconditionally, naturally, and automatically trigger a response. For example, when you smell one of your favorite foods, you may immediately feel hungry. The next one is the unconditioned response. The unconditioned response is the unlearned response that occurs naturally in response to unconditioned stimulus. The feeling of hunger in response to the smell of food is the unconditioned response. The next one is the conditioned stimulus. The conditioned stimulus is previously or before conditioning. It is a neutral stimulus that after becoming associated with the unconditioned stimulus, eventually it trigger a conditioned response. Conditioned response is the learned response to the previously neutral stimulus. Then the next one is the principle of acquisition. It refers to the first stages of learning when a response is established. The acquisition phase is the consistent pairing of the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus that produces conditioned response. It refers to the period of time when the stimulus come to evoke the conditioned response. The principle of acquisition, it is the initial stage of learning when response is first established and gradually strengthened. Once the response has been acquired, you can gradually reinforce the response to make sure the behavior is well learned. The second principle is the time lag or the factor. If there is a time lag between the presentation of unconditioned stimulus and a conditioned stimulus, then the required response will not be obtained. The next one is the principle of extinction. The extinction is when the occurrence of a conditioned response decreases or disappear. If the unconditioned stimulus, that is the smell of the food, is no longer paired with the conditioned stimulus, that is a whistle or a bell, eventually the conditioned response, that is your hunger, will disappear. The next is the spontaneous recovery. It is the reappearance of the conditioned response after a rest period or a period of lessened response. If the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus are no longer associated, extinction will occur very rapidly after a spontaneous recovery. The next one is the principle of stimulus generalization. Stimulus generalization is the tendency for the conditioned stimulus to evoke similar response after the responses has been conditioned. The discrimination is the next principle. It is the ability to differentiate between a conditioned stimulus and other stimuli that have not been paired with the unconditioned stimulus. For example, if a bell tone were the conditioned stimulus, discrimination would involve being able to tell the difference between the bell tone and other similar sounds. So now let's try to understand this classical conditioning theory, how we can make use of this theory in the classroom teaching. Through conditioning, good habits can be formed among students. Again, conditioning of emotion, you can make teaching learning more effective and favorable attitude towards the subjects. Conditioning enables the students to have a better outlook, develop sympathy and many other positive attitudes and habits. It can uproot the belief, certain false fear, develop love or hatred can be created towards certain objects or events. And most of the learning is associated with the process of conditioning right from childhood. Parents at home and teachers at school show affection, loving attitude, sympathetic treatment produce a desirable impact on children through the process of conditioning. So in that way, if you look at it, conditioning has got a lot of impact on the personality development of children. Thank you.